Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Welcome to the People's Law School. We've been doing this program about 30 years, and I want you to know tonight it is a great honor and privilege for us to have back Mr. Charles Edgar. He spoke about 25 years ago to this group, and I finally convinced him to come back and talk to us one more time. And tell you a little bit about Charlie Edgar. He is an investigator. He is a private investigator. He, by the way, has had over the last 4 decades the finest investigation firm here in North Alabama. He and his partner, I want to point out Nancy Noblet, who's sitting here on the front row and in the blue sweater, he and she have been partners over the last 30 years, I guess, and I want you to know that their reputation is beyond reproach. When they come into court, they are respected, they're considered honest, and unlike all of us that see on the television programs what we see of these low-down investigators that are willing to do anything, nobody who's in his right mind who wants to win his lawsuit has such a person on his side in court. And the reason is because the judges hate them, everybody in the court system hates them, and the jury knows that they're crooks and they won't have them in their business, don't want them around their lawsuit. That's why we have, in my law firm, have always used Charlie Edgar and his firm, and they have done a magnificent job. For your information, before he set up his investigation firm over 40 years ago, he had graduated from the University of Tennessee, and prior to that he was with the Interstate Commerce Commission, and he also worked for State Farm and Allstate. Also, Charlie Edgar may be the only private investigator in the entire universe who is also a preacher. He is a Presbyterian pastor. He has been awarded by the Erskine Seminary the Doctorate of Divinity, and he's probably the only private investigator in the world that has been awarded a Doctorate of Divinity. He is truly admired. He and his wife Joyce, by the way, who's seated here on the front row, she and he, they have 6 children and 18 grandchildren, and they are very, very involved in the Westminster Christian School, have been since its inception. And I'm proud to call him my investigator. Also, as an aside, I will tell you that Charlie Edgar, when he was growing up in New Jersey, ran on the track team. I know that. And he also on his team was a guy named Oogie Horowitz, who later became Michael Landon, the movie star that you've seen on TV. So I thought that was sort of interesting. But it's a great honor for me to introduce and present to you tonight Charlie Edgar. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I really want to hire Alan to do my funeral. It would be, all of those great remarks would be perfect for that. My task tonight is to describe the role of the investigator. And on my little outline, I started off, I think the theme is the old Jack Webb line. Show how old I am. But you remember he was always, I just want the facts, ma'am. And that really is what we're all about. We want to get the facts. Now, we're told that the oldest profession in the world is that of the prostitution. But I would say that if that is the case, back in those caveman days, John Dola was running down to this particular cave where Susio was, and Jan Dola wanted to know why. And she probably hired somebody to find out why all these men, these husbands, were going down to Susio's cave. And that's probably where the first private investigators were. So we're probably as old as the oldest profession. And there is, that is often domestic relation, that kind of infidelity is probably in most firms, private investigation firms, the main activity. We've stayed away from that, mainly because when I was doing solo by myself before Snoblet came along. I hated it. To me, doing surveillance is sort of like waking up in the middle of the night. You wake up in the middle of the night and you lay there and you think, gosh, I've been awake for an hour. And you look at the clock and 6 minutes has gone by. And to me, that's the way it seems with that. So I stayed away from that. Actually, I was, as he said, I'd worked for the Interstate Commerce Commission and done that kind of business investigation, which was fairly similar in nature to what Matt described for OSHA. Had some of the same problems he described, overwhelmed, understaffed, you couldn't contact everybody. But I learned that part of it, and then I learned about the civil side of lawsuits. Now, in all of the law, and when you talk to these lawyers, when you get right down to it, the big thing is you got to have a pocket. And I tell people in Huntsville, Alabama, criminal law is not very great because we don't have rich criminals. Most of them are just sleazebags. So we don't, most of the work that we get and that it's out there for criminal work is court appointed. When there's a capital murder case, the state of Alabama is required to make sure that the people are provided with defense attorneys if they're indigent and an investigator. So we primarily get that on the criminal side. Occasionally somebody has the wherewithal to hire somebody, but it's pretty rare. So we're on that side. Now I want to just touch on the history of private investigations. If you do a little history study, Google it, what you come up with. One of the very first private investigators that you read about was a Frenchman named Francois Vidocq. I failed French twice, so I pronounce it pretty good. He was in 1833, and then the oldest firm that we hear about is Pinkertons, who were hired by the Yankees in the Civil War, and they were into commercial private investigation. Now, private investigation came about as we moved from an agrarian to an industrial society. In the old days, when you lived in little tiny towns, little communities, everybody knew everybody's business. You really didn't have to hire anybody. You just talk to the right lady, and you get all the information that you needed. But as we became commercialized, and you don't know everybody's business, then you needed to have information. So that's when it grew up, and it became popularized about the 20s or the 30s in the last century, 1920, 1930. And you read about Sherlock Holmes and Sam Spade and some of these famous people from fiction that have set the stage for the private investigators that Alan referred to. It had a dumpy little office, fifth of whiskey in the bottom drawer, and so on and so forth. Always a beautiful girl floating around, you know. How unreal. Except Nancy did come to work for me. But there are a variety of investigative agencies now. You have the military has investigators, the government has investigators, businesses have investigators. Many law firms have their own staff investigators. Not too many in this part of the country. That's usually in larger cities, but they are that. But the private investigator law firms are generally on the small side. We're probably fairly large for a private investigator firm. We have 8 on staff, and we're really more the term that a lot of people use. We belong to an organization called the National Association of Legal Investigators, and we probably provide services to the legal field. We do investigative work, We do, we have got into real estate abstracting. We do a fair amount of that. We video depositions. Alan said he took one today. Sometimes to preserve the testimony, they want a video of it. We've done that. So we do services to the legal field. And ours, most like law firms, you've realized as these people have spoken to you, that there are lawyers that specialize in particular areas. And so it is with the investigation firms. You have some specialty. And ours is primarily on the civil side, and a big part of it is car wrecks. Almost said accident, but as Matt pointed out, that's not a great word. They're car wrecks. They happened. And so we are in the civil side and do that kind primarily. But as most law firms and in smaller cities, you do a little bit of everything. But the practice, and legal practice in a city like this is some criminal, some car wrecks, estates, and wills and that kind of thing. And so we do that, and of course the famous domestic things. Now, I did not personally like the domestic side of things, domestic surveillance, and I haven't kept up. One of the things you can do today, if you do the domestic investigation, is put a little tracker on. You can sit on a computer and watch the vehicle go around. But there are questions. Sometimes when new things come along, it takes a while to determine what's legal and what's illegal. There's no statute, but there are questions about privacy. What an investigator does if he gets a case like that and he is into the electronic thing, he gives it to the spouse who's hired him and gets them to put it on. And you think you're safe. Now, I'm certainly not rich, but we've managed to acquire some assets. We have some apartments, and I just don't want a lawsuit, and I don't want the question. We haven't really we just don't use that kind of electric. We just do it the old way, and you follow somebody and find out what they do. We worry about going onto somebody's property. If we're watching somebody, we look and see what the boundaries of their property are. We don't go on the property. You may take a picture from the street, someplace like that, but we don't do that. Occasionally, I've had investigators who want background information. And one of the things a few years ago that became open territory is your trash can. I can go down to your house and dump your trash and rifle through it, and there's a lot of information there. I had an investigator that really was into that. He did that quite a bit. But our firm is primarily into what they call torts and civil action and the real estate. Now, interestingly enough, we could be called Charlie's Angels. It happens to be all of the investigators, including the chief investigator now. I'm semi-retired. I graduated from college in '56. You'll see that on my resume. There was a time that I wanted to be able to say I was experienced, but a year or so ago, I got a phone call. A lawyer called down here, and somebody gave me the name. The lawyer was in New York. He didn't know me. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" And I started to say, since I got out of college in '56, that I thought, his mental image, if a guy graduated in '56, might be on crutches and this, that, and the other side. We incorporated in '84, so I answered it like that. But we have, that gives you enough investigation. I don't think you're some old codger. But that's the kind of the makeup of our law firm. Some of our abstractors are male, which is sort of a typical typical female profession. But we have one girl who had, she had experience with Allstate Insurance Company as an adjuster, and she was very good. Nancy's background was in banking and car paper and things like that. That was, that really sparked my interest. The little, the way we got to each other is she called me one day and she said, Alan Brinkley said I needed to come talk to you. And that's usually the introduction to a domestic case. And so when the office door opened, here comes this cute little girl in. I thought, oh, surely she's not going through a divorce. And she sat down and she said, I want to be a private investigator. And I thought, oh, she watches too much TV. So we went on, and then we talked for a while, and she was working for a bank, and she was finding out information about people on the banking side, knew all kinds of things about the banking practice that I really didn't know, and I thought, I could use that. And we talked a while and worked out a scheme to try it out, and she came to work for me. And as Alan said, it's worked out well. We've been together 30 years and have had a great time. Now, what do? We get a case, somebody called up and it's been a car wreck, here's the accident report, do the standard investigation. Well, the standard investigation is to try to get, we try to preserve the facts, preserve the information. And you take statements from people, what happened, how did it happen. You take photographs of the scene, photographs of the vehicles, so that it's all there, so that you can show it, as Matt did when he had his screen up here. All those photographs were important. They tell a story. And that's our general standard investigation. But you have to know how to ask questions. I thought it was neat that he went first and he told about some of these things that he did in his industrial investigation. And we often go in his situation, I don't know his law firm, but in a firm like that, he's probably a very busy man. If somebody comes into his office, they've had the investigation, and he wants to do the kind of investigation that he mentioned, but he's tied up and he can't drop everything and run down there. We go out and we try to look around and you find out, is there a possibility? You haven't got much in the way of a case because of the workers' comp covering them, so you have to look for something else. Is there a chance it's a products liability case? You look at the equipment and see that, and we try to gather that kind of information and then tell them, here's what we have, what we probably can develop. And then he has to make a decision, is that a case that he wants to go forward with? And it's the same thing in any lawsuit. When I started out as a claim adjuster, and you're on the defense side of a civil lawsuit when you work for an insurance company. And we used to go talk to the plaintiff attorneys who handled the case for the person with the injury and the claim. And often they were bad accidents, and you thought, wow, it must be great to be a plaintiff and just draw in the money. But then we do a lot of work. Most of our work is for plaintiffs now. And there's a difficulty there. You have to have insurance, or the pocket, there has to be some collectible out there. You have to have sufficient injuries, and you have to have liability. The other party has to be wrong. And then we look at things. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of law, and I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, and if I mention something you think that I've said something that you're interested in, talk to a lawyer, because I am not that, and I don't represent myself that way. But you have a car wreck, and the first thing you have to determine, Alabama has a thing called a guest passenger statute. That says that if Nancy says, let's go for a ride, I want to show you something, and it's just casual, we're just going to a friendly look at a house or something like that, I'm a guest in her automobile. And in order, if it's a one-car accident, in order for me to collect, she's got to be guilty of wanton and willful negligence. But if she comes in and she says, listen, we've got a case down here and we need to go look at this and so on, we have what loosely called an agency relationship, and all she has to be guilty of is simple negligence. So if she runs a stop sign, does something just simple, I can collect. But I can't collect if I'm a guest in the car. So when we take these statements, when we go to do the investigation, we have to know enough to be able to do those things. If you do the Google search, you'll see Wikipedia mentions that most private investigators have an enforcement background, law enforcement. I did have that with the Interstate Commerce Commission. That was where it came from. But most of my background that's been helpful is that part that has to do with insurance and knowing that kind of information. One day a lawyer hired me. He said, got a one-car wreck. He said, I don't know whether I have anything at all. He said, it's probably a guest passenger statute. Kids were at a high school picnic up in Montesano, and they're going to the store, rolled in the ditch, and kid got hurt. My kid got hurt, but he said, you know, the guest passenger may knock me out. I said, well, let me just go talk to the kid. So I went and talked to him, and I said, you know, when I was in high school, I said, if we ever went, they were going to a little grocery store, they're going to get Cokes or something, take it back to the picnic. I said, if I went to a grocery store, walked in there, I grew up in the smoking days, I said, I'd bought a pack of cigarettes or a Coke or a pack of crackers or done something. I said, if you'd gotten to the store, would you have bought anything? He said, well, I probably would, yeah, I probably got a Coke and a pack of crackers. Yeah, I believe I would. I said, can I put in the statement that he was taking you to the store so you could buy a Coke and a pack of crackers? I said, yeah. And so I put that in there. A few weeks later, I went into the insurance company's attorney. I did work for them too. And the lawyer looked up and he said, Edgar, you cost me $7,500 a week ago because I'd gotten the kid out of the guest passenger statute. So we have to know to look for those things. Deborah, the girl who does a lot of the statement taking, worked on a case. One lawyer had turned it down. The case happened up in Tennessee. It didn't appear that there was any kind of insurance they could collect on. There didn't seem to be anything there. So he really didn't want to spend his money on it. Another lawyer took it and hired us, and Deborah was taking the statement. And Deborah asked a lot of questions. Now, ladies have a curiosity. They have an ability to think of questions to ask. And so Deborah's going along. She said, where'd the accident happen? She said, where'd you start out? She said, well, up in Illinois somewhere. She said, what were you doing up there? Well, I on the job. We worked there all week, and I was on my way home. She said, oh. She said, did you stay at a motel there in Tennessee? Yeah. Who paid for that? Oh, our company. And she went on and she developed this whole relationship and opened the pocket to the company. He was on duty, so it was collectible. We have to be able to think of those and know a little bit about the law in order to ask the right questions. One of my attorney friends told me he had a client that had taken an investigator's course, and he gave him an industrial accident like this. The fellow went out and built up this beautiful liability case where they'd done something wrong. But as Matt said, you can't collect on that. That doesn't work. But we go in and you have to look around and you look for, the biggest thing that we start out looking for is what they call, the last thing he had, I think, product liability. On a product, any product that's made, you're supposed to design out anything that's unsafe. You fix it so it's unsafe that way. And if you can't design it out, then you're supposed to guard it, put a guard on it. That's usually what he was talking about. They don't like the guard, so they rip them off. But you guard it. If you can't design it out, you can't guard it, then you have to label it. So you put the labels on. And nowadays, Jay Leno about every month makes a hoot about some product. You get a coffee cup and it says, "Be careful, this is hot." That's the label. They're trying to warn you, so we can't get out and find fault with it. But you have to be able to look for those things, and so that's where I think our specialty has been. We know a little bit about those things because of the insurance background. Our other investigator, when I came to town 50 years ago, Michelle Wallace's father was M.R. Wallace, and he was the only private investigator in town. So apparently she worked for him, worked around him enough, and picked up enough information that she's been pretty good on the, she helps Deborah. She goes out and does a lot of field work on civil cases, but she's picked up a lot of lawyers that like to use her on the criminal side. So we have that part covered. But the secret to all of it is to go back to the Jack Webb thing. The important thing in all of our investigations is the ability to get people to talk. And that's what you got to get in. People ask me all the time, do you, what's the best show about investigators? Well, I always tell them all the President's Men. Dustin Hoffman, if you remember that movie, if you saw it, and it's a long time ago, but he goes out to see this girl that he really wants some information. He knows she has the information. She's so reluctant. And he sat there and he talked to her and he drank coffee until he thought he was going to burst, and he goes on, and he'd talk about this, that, and the other, and then he'd sort of slide in. As soon as he started getting close, she'd back off, and then he'd talk again. And that's the thing you do. You just try to get somebody to talk. Now, the interesting thing is, once people are often very reticent, once you get them talking, then the floodgates open. You can't get them to shut up. So that's really the basic secret of investigations. I sometimes have these ladies that come into the office and want to hire us for domestic cases, and you start talking to them. Well, I mean, you learn, they'll tell you the secrets of their married life and this and that. I really don't need to know. All I need to know, where's he go? What's he like to do? I don't need to know all that other stuff. But once you get talking, that's the secret. So it's just the facts. That's what we try to do, and that's where it's so good. Now, one of the interesting things, when Nancy came to work for me, she has an uncanny ability to get information on the phone. I, on the other hand, scare people to death because I have a deep voice, and on the phone, I'm a threat. Our daughter had a friend when she was a teenager, and this friend would call the house, and if I answered the phone, she'd hang up. She was scared to death of me. And the funny thing was, the Givens here lived next door to us, and we kept their daughter for a couple nights one time, and we were eating dinner one night, and that subject came up, and they talked about this girl, Robin, who would call the house, and she was afraid to talk to me, and their daughter looked up and she said, "Scared of him?" And it was a riot. But we sort of teamed up. In person, I do pretty good, I guess. I work that way, but I don't do it on the phone. One of the very first cases that we ever had, we got a call from it. It was a complicated case, and I won't get into all of it. It was interesting. It was a California lawyer called me, and he said, I need to know where this girl lived. It was back in the 80s when they were, they catch these kids, and the kids were in cults. They pull them out of cults and rough them up and then befriend them and decultize, I guess you'd call it. But that was what he was working on. And he said, now, I have a phone number, but I don't want you to mess with my phone number. I just want to locate her. And he said, I called an attorney here in town. They said, he gave me two names. He said, he gave me one of your competitors. And he said, if you want somebody that lays in the bushes and does this and that, call him. If you want somebody straight up and down, call Charlie Edgar. So he said, I went with the other guy. He said he's had it about a month and hadn't pulled anything up. So I gave it to Nancy, and the next morning, the very next morning, the guy calls from California about 11 o'clock, 9 o'clock when they opened out there, and he said, I'm going to call you off the case. He said he called me and gave me the address. I said, oh, okay. I said, was it 500 so-and-so and so street? And he said, yeah. He said, you already know that? I said, oh, yeah. And I said, she used to live in Chattanooga. I said, her social security number is so-and-so and so-and-so, and something else. I had a lot of personal information that she picked up off the phone. And he said, you already have that? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I was going to call you off, but he said, I really owe it to my client to have the better investigator. He said, you stay on it. He said, I'll pay him, and you keep going. And he came to town, and it was a high-profile case. He was really interesting. He went with Nancy to see this couple, and she said she was an interpreter. They were good old Alabama kids, and she said he was talking California and talking really fast, and she said I had to stop and explain what that meant in Alabamian. So she was the interpreter. But he wanted her to be a rebuttal witness. He didn't want to give her name out. He wanted to hire an attorney here in Huntsville for her to go to talk to, so that she'd know exactly what she was getting into and so on. And they did all that. And one of the frustrating things about our business, a lot of times, we don't find out what happened afterwards. We lose track. I don't know whatever it was she ever went out there. But it wasn't a big bill, but it was a pretty fair bill. And that was just for her skill on the telephone. And I used to tell people, I said, somebody could call me and say, find out what kind of toilet paper Obama uses. And I said, she'd get on the phone, she'd come in, those Secret Service, but it's Scott tissue. It was just uncanny. So that is basically what we do. Now, I want to tell a couple of war stories. I say war stories. I was in the Navy, and we called them sea stories. And most of them, probably, if you had military, you were in the Army, and it's war stories. When I tell them, I always preface this. There's an old story that, do you know the difference between a fairy tale and a sea story? And no, I don't. Well, a fairy tale begins once upon a time. Sea story begins, this is a God's honest truth. And then other than that, there's no difference. So I'm going to tell a few of those. But again, I go back to one of Nancy's early cases was probably one of the most interesting. Well, let me pause. Let me just back off a minute from that case and say this. One of the problems with everybody's knowledge of the fiction private investigators is that you really get a skewed view of what investigations are, because they always have these big, wonderful cases that seem to follow one on the other. They get a case in the office, they just work on that day and night for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it takes, and nothing else. Well, they don't come along that often, and you have to have some bread and butter along the line. You have to have little cases that keep your firm open and everything. So we don't get those biggies that you see on TV all the time, but we've had a few. I was going to run through one or two of those and then open it for questions if you have any. But the one case that she worked on I thought was really interesting. Was I was working on a thing where they were selling fake Chanel No. 5 at different places. Now these, people make Chanel No. 5 probably don't care that they're selling it at flea markets, the fake stuff, or selling it in some auction store or something of that nature. It doesn't affect their clientele, but they have to guard their copyright, and they have to police it. So they have to give us a few dollars every once in a while to try to put a stop to this stuff. And I had been working on that. Also, that period in our electronics business, the Group W cable, I guess that was Westinghouse, but Group W sold these little boxes that you put it on your TV, and that's how you got your cable. And every once in a while, a guy'd come into town, put an ad in the paper, and he'd sell you a box, and you could get all the stuff off the cable. And they would hire us to call them and make a buy, and then there was some procedure they had that was illegal, and they could go against them and stop it. So we were working on that, and she had bought one of these things, and she found out where the guy was down in Florida, in West Palm Beach. Well, she had a friend that worked for the Secret Service, and they were having lunch. I told her, I said, ask him if he's got any other things you could sell, like Chanel No. 5. And so she asked him, he said, no, but he said, you can make some money off fake Rolexes. So she went to lunch with the guy from the Secret Service, and in the course of conversation, he said, I've been down in Louisiana, there's a bunch of fake Rolexes. They're coming out of Florida somewhere, but we can't figure it out. She said, I might know. So we put it together, and we ended up hired by Group W Cable, Rolex, and the Secret Service, and all working down in Florida. And she got on the phone and she talked to him for a week or so, taped all these conversations. She knew more about that fellow than he knew about himself by the time it was over. He had property in North Carolina. She knew that, all this. So they put the thing together, and they all got together and flew her down to West Palm. She was supposed to buy some of these fake Rolexes. So she went down there, and the Secret Service had all these drug cars that she had. They'd give her, I think it was a Jaguar convertible. We talked about it today. It's been a while, and so that's why I can freely talk about it. But she was sporting around like that. Well, we found out that this guy lived in a gated community, and we had no idea whether, when he was in his office in this gated community, whether there were 4 or 5 employees or just him, and how dangerous would it be? And this was before the age of electronics, all of that kind of thing. So we weren't certain about her going in. I belonged to this NALI investigative group, and I'd gotten the name of a fellow down there, and he was an ex-sheriff or deputy or something, but he'd had that kind of background. And we worked out this little scheme, and he had a fellow who was going to be on a pole, climb up this pole and look down into the gated community to see whether she got in all right and so on. And then she was to get in and call her husband at the hotel, and then we were afraid to call the phone booth and tell the private investigator for fear he'd make the phone call. So her husband, who was a hotel, used to call them, and then he would call the phone booth. That was the setup. Well, I got a call from Nancy. She said, I'm not real certain whether I ought to go in or not. I'm not caring. I said, fine. I said, if you're not comfortable, get on Delta, come on back. You know, they, like Louis Gazard said, they fly every day. And I said, we don't get that much business. We'll never get business from them again, probably. Don't worry about it. So, and then I had also talked to a secretary at the Group W, and she'd gotten chummy with this guy down there, and they'd gotten, their conversation had gotten a little on the kinky side, and I was really concerned. So I thought she was coming back. Well, about 3 o'clock that afternoon, she said, I'm going in. I said, what happened? Well, they'd had this conference, and they had lawyers from all three groups in Miami, all three groups in West Palm, and a private investigator who had this black shirt on with the snake, whale teeth, all that kind of stuff, you know, flamboyant. And he got there and he said, first he asked her, said, are you licensed in Florida? She said, no, I'm a consumer in Florida. And then he said, she'll never make it. She said, I sent the best private investigator from Boston down here. Said that guy beat him up and put him on a plane and sent him back up there. And he said, I'll buy everybody here a steak dinner on the bet she can't make it in there. She was young then, 37, I guess. I'm going in. So she went in and bought those, and my only regret about that is I never picked up one for myself. But came back with a stash of Rolex watches, and they brought a lawsuit against the fellow, and he was already on probation and forbidden to do this, so he was facing a little jail time. And we got a call from the attorney that was going to take the case down there. It was a U.S. attorney. He said, "You record any statements in Florida?" And you know that's who we're working for. Yeah, recorded 3. Well, let's throw it in. In Florida, Alabama, you can record any conversation that you're a party to. In interstate commerce, in federal law, you can record any conversation you're a party to. Florida had a statute that said you had to have a judge's permission to record a conversation if the party didn't know about it. So we won't be able to go to court. Well, the Attorney General for Florida almost got in on this thing. He jumped up and gave immunity to her on that, and they went ahead with it, and he got sued. Then turned out this same statute in Florida had a civil provision in it, and he was allowed to sue for this kind of sort of like an invasion of privacy kind of thing, and he was going to do that. And they sent some papers up here, and at that time, Florida and Alabama had the same thing. If you served a paper, you had to be appointed by a circuit judge. I took the papers and found out that he hadn't been appointed, so we quashed that. Then they sent it up, and the deputy came around and just threw it on the secretary's desk, and neither one of us got a copy. That was bad service. And I called, I won't say the sheriff's name, but I called him, and there's sort of just a age-old animosity between private investigators and enforcement people, because the private investigators are always defending the bad guys. I said, we're working on the good guys this time. That was probably our biggest story. The other really interesting for me, I thought it was the highlight of the career. We worked on the 93 car wreck that happened on Interstate 75 up above Chattanooga in front of the Bowater plant in the early 90s, and worked on that for months and months and months. And that was quite a challenge. It was really interesting because at the beginning, I went up there, and of course everybody wants to know what happened. You just get on it. Well, what happened? They went out there, there were cars all over the place, and the record drivers just picked up cars and hauled them off, and in most cases didn't know whose car they had, who owned it, or anything. Just they had to run the tags down and this, that, and the other. So we had to really wait a month or so to get the report from the state before we could even start on it. But for about 4 or 5 days, I was running up and down the highway and go do this, go look at this, find this, do this. And it was just mass confusion. But it was a really interesting wreck. And then the other one I tell a little sea story about is, you may remember it. This is one, it's like so much of life in some investigations, everything just seems to go right. Sometimes everything goes wrong. And it's the same way for enforcement and so on. But remember the Gonzalez, Angela Gonzalez case in Russellville, Alabama? Little girl got burnt. She had, the picture was in the paper, the cutest little girl you'd ever seen, the picture, button eyes, and little smile. They, it was a tragic kind of a story. The little girl, her daddy separated from her mother in Illinois, came down to Russellville, and he had married this little girl down there. She wasn't about 19 or 20 years old, and she gets this little 6-year-old girl, and the mother, the natural mother up in Illinois, all she did all day long was sit with the little girl and watch porno movies. This little girl's mouth was foul, and she wouldn't do it. She was out of control. DHR said, you've got to get her up to get treatment, and the only place to get treatment was in Florence. The father was just a kind of a day laborer kind of guy. They didn't have any way to get her up there. So one day, the little girl cussed her stepmother out, and she washed her mouth out with soap, and she threw up. And then they put her to bed, and she had diarrhea. So Mama grabbed her, turned the water on, and apparently just turned the hot water on. Grabbed her up and put her in the tub, and the little girl fussed, but she fussed about everything. She'd bang her head against the wall, and then she realized the water was hot and jerked her out. But the doctor later on testified that she probably had 30-degree burns. They lived in a house trailer that wasn't as long as this room, and it had a little hot water heater about that big. It was on 160 degrees, and the water, he testified the water coming out was probably 145 degrees and would give 3rd-degree burns. So she didn't cry and scream and holler. They bought salve and put on her. But the mother didn't want to go to the hospital because they might accuse them of purposely harming the child. So they put salve on her, and in the night she died. And then they're really in trouble. So then they put her in garbage bags and threw her in the old Bear Creek over there. And they spent weeks trying to find, they reported her as missing. And they spent weeks trying to find her. And then finally the mother went in, confessed, and but they didn't have anything else. Father wasn't going to tell anything. They couldn't get an indictment because you have to have corroborating evidence. They had nothing but this little statement. They went through one grand jury. They came up on the second grand jury. The people were screaming, and finally, there was an attorney that was trying to represent both parties, and she went over to try to plea bargain, and it wasn't even an indictment, but she went over there, And they said, well, get him on the phone and see if he'll talk. And they tapped their own phone and didn't indicate they were part of it. So the judge just threw everybody out. He wouldn't let they had to get an out-of-town DA to handle it. And Jimmy Fry, who was the DA in Limestone County, handled it. And it was just, everything was wrong. It was just pitiful. But they ended up, and they were charged with capital murder. They ended up, we did finally work out a plea bargain. Well, I worked for an attorney that represented the father, and they plea bargained him to 10 years with time served. And then they tried the case down in Greenville, Alabama, and the jury did the same thing down there, 10 years. But it was just one of those things where everything went wrong. Well, I've gone a little further. Are there any questions that anybody wanted to ask?
How much time did she get? I lived in Florence at that time, so how much time did she get?
Both of them got 10 years, and both of them time served. They'd both been in jail about 3 or 4 years. So they couldn't get any attorney. The attorney that I worked for couldn't get anybody to help out. And he said, "Do you think there's an attorney in Huntsville that might be interested in working with me?" I said, "I believe Fred Simpson would love it because he'd been DA here." I said he would know what DA would know what a DA was supposed to do and not supposed to. I thought he'd be perfect. So he ended up handling that.
Was the criticism that they were under investigation and the statement was bad without reading their rights?
Well, they only had the statement. They didn't have any corroborating evidence. That was the biggest problem. They couldn't find a body, and the husband wouldn't confess. So you have to have some corroborating evidence.
I will mention that Fred Simpson's son is going to speak to the People's Law School in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Sure. That'd be a lot like Fred.
Now, if there are no other questions, I mentioning Derek, I throw out one more war story. But, we worked on one. There was after Huntsville Mall closed, a man opened a little car lot up there. It was an older man in a wheelchair, and a kid from up on Sand Mountain, Albertville, Boaz, somewhere up there, came over one day. He was in the Army, had just finished basic. He was down at El Paso, and he found a Camaro there at this car lot, and he wanted that, it ate him up. He spent all day Friday trying to get a loan from the credit union down there and couldn't get it worked out. So he came back Saturday morning, started it again trying to get the money. Well, about noontime, the old man said, "I've got to go to a wedding, and I got to leave." Well, the kids still wanted the car, and they got to arguing and fussing, and the kid ended up stabbing him and killing him. And the police got there probably about 1 or 1:30 or 2 in that area. And they started working on the thing, trying to figure out what was going on. They were looking for clues in the dumpster and this, that, and the other. And one of the detectives was sitting at this old man's desk. And this is back in the days of the old IBM Selectrics, if you remember those. And they had a cartridge for a tape. And the detective sat there and he pulled the tape out, ripped it apart, and read the tape. Read all about this Camaro. And there's no Camaro out there. Had a name, an address, everything about the kid up on the mountain. They got in their car and they drove up. On the mountain, went by the parents' house, and when at this point in history, these homicide investigators were all 3 of them here in Huntsville were great guys. Well, these parents were he said, "Oh, we just paid off our house. I guess we'll have to take another mortgage to help him." And they said, "Don't do that. He would qualify as indigent," and said, "You can get a court-appointed lawyer, and you might get a better lawyer than you could afford yourself." And sure enough, they got Fred, and of course Derek helped them out. So they had, a really good criminal lawyer. And when we get in on these these investigations, we get all of the reports that the work product of the police department to review, and you play Monday morning quarterback. So I read through all that and read what had happened and how they'd gone up there. I mean, by 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, they had the kid and were bringing him back down here. It was over. But Derek called me and said, "What did you think about it?" I said, "I'll tell you what," I said, "I slept so good last night." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "If our guys are that sharp," I said, "we're under good protection here." I said, that was great. That was great work. I think my time was up.
Thank you so much.